The camp of Israel stretched endlessly across the wilderness, a sea of tents surrounding the sacred tabernacle at the center. Every morning as the sun lifted over the horizon, the people awoke to the same reminder. They were not merely wandering tribes, but a nation chosen by God. Yet being chosen came with a weight they were only beginning to understand. After the exodus from Egypt, God now taught them what it meant to truly belong to Him. The book of Leviticus opened like a divine instruction manual, yet it was far more than rules. It was a story of holiness, a story of how a sinful people could draw near to a holy God. One early morning, young Eliab followed his father to the tabernacle courtyard. The air was thick with the smell of burning grain and the smoke of offerings rising heavenward. It was Eliab's first time seeing the rituals up close, and his father had promised to explain everything. "These offerings," and his father whispered, "teach us who God is. They show us how serious sin truly is, and how great His mercy is." Eliab watched as worshipers brought grain offerings, simple gifts from the labor of their hands, symbolizing gratitude. Others brought fellowship offerings, celebrating peace between God and His people. But the most sobering sight was the sin and guilt offerings. People came with bowed heads, laying their hands on the animals, confessing the weight of their failures before the Lord. It was a vivid picture, a life given so another might live. As the priests carefully followed God's instructions, Eliab understood why every detail mattered. Holiness wasn't casual. It required reverence. God wanted Israel to see the difference between the sacred and the common, between purity and defilement. He gave laws not to burden them, but to protect and set them apart. The Sabbath reminded them they were not slaves anymore. The Passover reminded them they were rescued, and the Day of Atonement, the most solemn day of all, reminded them that once a year, God provided cleansing for the entire nation. Eliab listened as his father repeated the foundational command, "Love your neighbor as yourself." At first, it sounded simple, but as they walked through the camp, past widows, foreigners, the elderly, the poor, he realized it was a command that touched every corner of life. Holiness wasn't just sacrifices or rituals. It was how they treated one another, how they conducted business, how they spoke, how they forgave, how they lived. That night, as Eliab lay in his tent, he thought deeply about everything he had seen. Israel was unlike any other nation. They were called to reflect God's purity, compassion, and justice. And though they were still learning, the journey toward holiness had begun. Days passed, and Eliab found himself returning again and again to the courtyard of the tabernacle. He watched the priests move with precision, their linen garments shining in the sunlight. Everything they did, every sprinkle of blood, every burning portion of sacrifice, spoke of order, intention, and divine purpose. Israel had lived in Egypt for generations, surrounded by idols and rituals that brought fear rather than hope. But now in the wilderness, God was reshaping their identity. Through His laws, He was teaching them not just how to worship, but how to live differently from every nation around them. One afternoon, Eliab sat beside his mother as she prepared the household for the Sabbath. "Why do we rest?" he asked. She smiled gently. "Because God rested," she said, "and because He wants us to remember we are free. Rest is a gift. Freedom is a gift." Eliab had never thought of rest as something holy, but now he saw its deeper meaning. Each Sabbath was a weekly reminder that God was their true provider. They did not survive by their own strength, but by His grace. As the year went on, Eliab witnessed the first Passover celebrated in the wilderness. Families gathered, recalling the night when God struck Egypt and spared them. Though they were far from the land promised to them, the memory was alive. The laws God gave were not cold commands. They were rooted in love, redemption, and remembrance. Each celebration taught Israel who they were and who God was. Yet the laws about purity were the most challenging for Eliab to grasp. Why were some foods clean and others unclean? Why did touching certain things make a person unclean until evening? His father explained, "God is teaching us to distinguish. Holiness is learning to separate what draws us toward Him from what pulls us away." It wasn't merely about diet or washing. It was about cultivating a heart aware of God's presence. Israel was learning to honor God not only in the tabernacle, but in everyday choices. What they ate, how they cared for their bodies, how they treated the vulnerable among them. One day, Eliab helped a neighbor who had fallen ill. As he brought water and bread, he remembered the command, "Love your neighbor as yourself." It echoed in his heart. Holiness was not reserved for priests. It was something every Israelite was called to embody. As he served quietly, he felt he was offering something just as sacred as any grain sacrifice, a gift of compassion. The wilderness was harsh, but God's laws were shaping a people who would shine as a holy, set-apart nation. And Eliab, though still young, felt himself becoming part of this story. The seasons changed, and the wilderness tested Israel's resolve. Yet through every challenge, God's laws remained a steady foundation. Eliab noticed how the community was slowly transforming. Disputes were settled differently. People treated one another with more seriousness because they knew God cared about justice. Even the way they harvested, gathered, and shared their food changed. No longer was life about survival alone. It was about reflecting God's character. Eliab remembered the day he helped his father leave the corners of their field unharvested. At first, he wondered why they would leave good grain behind. But soon, travelers and the poor came to glean, gathering food with gratitude. This, his father said, is holiness too, making sure others have enough. The laws God gave touched every inch of life, teaching Israel to see every action as an opportunity to show mercy or honor him. One evening, Eliab approached the tabernacle and saw a long line of worshipers bringing their offerings. A young man stood near the priest, trembling as he confessed his wrongdoing. Eliab watched the priest lay the sacrifice upon the altar. The flames rose and the man's face softened with relief. It struck Eliab deeply. Sin brought separation, but God provided a way back. Every sacrifice whispered of forgiveness, of a God who did not abandon his people when they failed. But the most solemn day Eliab ever witnessed was the Day of Atonement. The entire camp became still. No one worked. No one busied themselves with daily tasks. The high priest entered the Holy of Holies, carrying the blood that symbolized the cleansing of the whole nation. Eliab held his breath. If anything went wrong, the priest would die in the presence of God's glory. When the high priest finally reappeared, alive and bearing blessing, the camp erupted in relieved joy. For another year, the people were cleansed. That night, Eliab sat under the stars, thinking about the holiness of God. Holiness was beautiful, but also overwhelming. It required humility and honesty. It demanded a heart willing to be shaped. Yet it also revealed a God who desired closeness with his people. Through every law, sacrifice, and instruction, God was not pushing Israel away, but drawing them nearer. Eliab realized that holiness wasn't about being perfect. It was about belonging to God, letting him define their identity. In a world filled with nations worshiping powerless idols, Israel was called to reflect the living God. Eliab felt a stirring in his heart, a desire to live out this calling, not because the laws demanded it, but because God deserved it. Years passed, and Eliab grew from a curious boy into a young man who understood more deeply the weight and wonder of God's laws. The wilderness journey continued, and though Israel faced rebellions, fears, and hardships, the call to holiness remained unchanged. Eliab began helping the Levites, assisting with small tasks around the tabernacle. The closer he came to the sacred spaces, the more he felt the trembling awe that holiness inspired. One day, while carrying supplies, he overheard a group of foreigners approaching the camp. They were weary travelers seeking refuge. Eliab remembered the law. Treat the foreigner as one native born among you. He guided them toward shelter and offered water. Their grateful eyes reminded him again that Israel's holiness was meant to reflect God's compassion to the nations. As festival seasons came and went, Eliab experienced the rhythm of life God intended for his people. The Feast of Unleavened Bread reminded them to remove sin from their lives, just as they removed leaven from their homes. The Feast of Trumpets called them to repentance and renewal, and the Feast of Tabernacles taught them to rejoice, remembering how God provided shelter in the wilderness. These holy days were like anchor points in Israel's story. reminding them that holiness was also celebration, joy rooted in God's faithfulness. One night, Eliab sat with his father near the fire. "Do you ever feel the laws are too many, too heavy?" he asked. His father looked into the flames. "At times," he sighed, "but each law shows us God sees our lives in every detail. Nothing is too small for him. Each command teaches us to trust, to love, to walk carefully. Holiness is not a burden. It is the privilege of belonging to the Most High." Eliab pondered those words long after the fire burned low. He finally understood that holiness wasn't a list of restrictions. It was a relationship. The God who rescued them from Egypt wanted his people to walk closely with him, to mirror his heart in everything they did. The sacrifices taught forgiveness. The purity laws taught awareness. The festivals taught remembrance. And the command to love your neighbor as yourself tied everything together. It showed that holiness always flowed outward in kindness, justice, and compassion. When Israel looked ahead toward the Promised Land, Eliab felt hope rising. They were not wandering aimlessly. They were being shaped, prepared, refined. And he knew the laws given in the wilderness would guide them for generations. God's desire was not only to bring them to a land, but to make them a people who reflected his holiness in every step they took. Eliab stood gazing at the distant horizon, his heart full. Israel was God's set-apart nation, and he too was part of that sacred calling.